Welcome. In this lesson, we are going to finish up our unit on inheritance with a look at the object class. Let's get started. We've got two learning goals for today. The first is that you can explain how the object class relates to all other Java objects. This is done with inheritance. And second, that you can identify, describe, and override the equals and toStrings methods. In computer science, we throw the word object around a lot, but it's more than just a descriptor in Java. Object is actually a Java class. And it turns out that all classes, even the ones that you write, inherit from the object class automatically. The object class includes a total of 11 methods, and so that means that any object we create inherits these 11 methods. Most of them are beyond the scope of this course, but we are going to discuss two of them, the toString and the equals method. We've talked about the toString method really since the very beginning of the course, but we've never talked about where it actually comes from until now. The purpose of the toString method is to return a string representation of an object. And so you can see right here, I'm actually going to create an object. So I say object O equals new object. So normally, right, when we make an object, we make a more specific type of object like a string or a scanner or whatever, but you actually can just make a generic object. And to prove to you that the toString method exists in the object class, I say println o.toString. And of course, we may remember that the toString method by default returns the class name and the memory reference that you can see right here. The default behavior of the toString method isn't necessarily super useful in many cases, so oftentimes we override it so that it returns more useful information. And again, we've been doing this since the beginning. We just didn't necessarily know we were overriding the method. But every object inherits the toString, and then we can create our own version of it, which is helpful because then when we printline an object, it uses our toString method instead of the default one. You've also seen the equals method before, particularly when we've compared two strings to determine if they contain the same characters. You probably assumed that the equals method was part of the string class, but it's actually not. It's inherited from the object class. The string class just overrides it to change its behavior. But let's see how it works by default. So I'll go ahead and create two objects, O1 and O2, and you can see that I can compare them with the equals method. Now, the default behavior of the equals method is just comparing the object references. So by default, it works in exactly the same way as using the double equal signs. This isn't necessarily useful in most cases, which is why oftentimes a class will choose to override the equals method. Again, we can see this overriding take place with the string class where I make two string objects that contain the same characters, and I can determine if they're equal by saying s1.equals s2. Again, this works because the string class overrides the method to compare the characters. We've overridden the toString method a number of times, but we've never overridden equals, so we need to talk about that a little bit. This particular example is going to be the equals method for the student class that we've done in a few previous lessons. So it's going to determine if two students are equal to each other. So starting with the method header, remember that when we override a method, the header has to be exactly the same as in the superclass. And so we have public Boolean equals, and then for a parameter, we have an object. Now, remember, this is for the student class, and so we might be tempted to say student there because we're comparing students, but the object class doesn't know that. So the object class has to be really generic and say that we're going to use an object parameter, and we have to match that because we're overriding. Now, next, we actually have to teach Java that that parameter is a student because it doesn't know. All it knows is that other is an object. Now, you and I know it's going to be a student, so that's why we have this line of code where we say student equals other typecast to a student. So now we've got Java understanding and knowing that this parameter is indeed a student. Finally, we have our comparison. And this looks complicated, but actually all it does is it compares the name of the student in this object to the name of the student in the other object, and does the same thing with the birthday. So if two students have the same name and same birthday, we'll consider them equal and return true. Otherwise, we'll consider them not equal and return false. Let's wrap up with a quick understanding check. Hopefully this won't be too difficult. Question 1, what is the default behavior of the equals method if it's not overridden? And number 2, what is the default behavior of the toString method if it's not overridden? Pause the video, think about these answers, and then we'll talk about it. All right, for number 1, the equals method's default behavior is really just to compare the object's references, so it works exactly the same as equal equal. For number 2, the default behavior of the toString method is to return a string containing the name of the class and the memory reference. Both of these methods are often overridden to have more useful behaviors, but remember, they're both inherited from the object class. Now that you've seen this lesson, you should be able to explain how the object class relates to all other Java objects, and also identify, describe, and override the equals and toString methods.